And we're talking about AGMs today, to host or not to host. We're going to wait a couple of minutes because we're not yet at noon and we want to max our time. So we're going to let everybody join us and we'll give them just a to do that.
But not much happening.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I got it on downstairs.
All right. Well, we're going to get started because we're just a little bit past noon. Welcome to CondoWise Learning. We're going to ask that you keep your microphones muted and turn off your video because we want to ensure the quality of our recording. If you could please use the chat function with your questions, that would be great. And we'll be taking questions at the end because we have a few things to get through today. And we've structured in such a way that we're going to have a video with the PowerPoint available afterwards. Now, I just want to let you know that as much as we're lawyers, we're not giving out binding legal opinions because each condo is different. I would strongly suggest that you speak to your own solicitors in order to make sure that you've got it in writing for your direct boards what the legal position should be so that they can rely on a professional opinion to fulfill their Section 37 obligations under the Act. Today, we have Julia White, who's one of our lawyers, who will be taking us through some of the material, and Victor. There's Victor. Hey, Victor.
Hey, guys.
And so we're going to take you through today to host or not to host. And as I said, it's going to be recorded. So, Julia, why don't you take us to the next slide and begin.
Okay, so first we want to provide an overview of where we are today and the status of the relevant provisions of the Condominium Act with respect to AGMs and timelines. So pursuant to Section 45(2) of the Condominium Act, condos are required to hold their AGMs within 6 months of their fiscal year end. However, as a result of COVID-19 and the requirement to hold AGMs within the regular timeline set out under the Act were suspended. On July 24th, 2020, the Ontario government revoked the regulation which declared a state of emergency in the province with the enactment of Bill 195. As a result, the mandatory timelines for condos to hold their AGMs have now been triggered. So what does this mean? Do you have to hold your AGM? The simple answer is yes. You should at least make a good faith attempt to hold your AGM, which leads us to our next question. If you're required to hold your AGM, when do you have to hold it by? So if the last day to hold your condo's AGM was a date between March 17th, 2020, when the COVID-19 state of emergency was officially declared, and July 24th, 2020, when the COVID-19 state of emergency officially ended, then you have 90 days following July 24th to hold your AGM, which means up to and including October 22nd. If the last day to hold your condo's AGM was a date that was within 30 days following July 24th. So between July 25th and August 24th, then you have 120 days after July 24th to hold your AGM, which means up to and including November 21st. If the last day to hold your AGM is after August 24th, then the AGM is to be held on or before the original deadline. There will be no deferrals. So the question now is, if you have to hold your AGM, how are you going to hold it? So there are now 3 ways that a condo can hold their AGM. There's the traditional way that we're all quite familiar with, the in-person meeting. There's the new normal way, which is electronically, by phone, and virtually. And then there's the not so familiar way, which is the hybrid meeting. So Victor, why don't you take us through a bit about electronic meetings?
Sure, thanks, Julia. So essentially what's happened now is that the Ontario government has actually enacted a bill, a piece of legislation, allows all condos to hold AGMs electronically. So that's usually by virtual meeting, so like by Zoom here, or by telephone. But as we'll talk about later, telephone actually has some technological and practical limitations. So it's obviously preferable for the meeting to be held virtually by a video conferencing system. So what Bill 190, sorry, excuse me. What Bill 190 actually does, which is the piece of legislation that the government has enacted, it allows condos to actually hold an AGM electronically, even though they don't have a bylaw that actually allows for it. So some condos have what we call, sorry, an electronic meeting bylaw. And that actually allows condos to hold it virtually, and then when the bylaw is enacted until forevermore, when the bylaw is still untitled. But if you don't have a bylaw, if your condo does not have such an electronics meeting bylaw, what will happen is that come November 22nd, 2020, once the government's Bill 190 time period has ended, you will no longer be technically allowed to have a meeting virtually or by phone without such a bylaw in place. So because of that deadline of Sunday, November 22nd, we are now recommending that most condos hold their AGMs if they have to within this time period virtually, and if you can do so, have an electronics meeting bylaw also voted on at that AGM. So what does electronic means mean? What does the Act define as telephonic or electronic means? That's in section 52, 1.1 of the Condominium Act. And it basically means anything that uses a telephone or any other electronic or other technological means to transmit information or data, including telephone calls, fax, email, automated touch-tone telephone system, computer or computer networks. Now, I've never seen an AGM held by fax, but generally speaking, it basically boils down to video or a phone. And Patricia, why don't you talk about the hybrid?
Well, thanks, Victor and Julia. The hybrid is a combination, really. It is going to be a combination of the in-person and electronic meeting. And I can honestly, say we've been chatting about this at the office, and, somebody who works here, some of you may know him, his name is Richard. He has a very definitive idea on what that looks like. For him, he feels like an interim hybrid version of meetings will exist for a period of time until the technology catches up. But I can tell you that his hybrid interpretation, and I would agree with him on this, is that hybrid ultimately is going to mean that everybody participates electronically, whether they're in the room or not. So what that means is you all become, or your clients and your unit owners become gamers. So when you show up at a meeting in person, what will happen is somebody will hand you a gaming device that looks like a gaming device, and you'll be able to register your votes as you go once you've verified your who you are and that you're entitled to vote. Or it'll be on your phone. Most people have phones, but not everybody does. Some people I know still use flip phones, and those phones will only provide limited participation. But that's what we're going towards. But for the purposes of our discussion today, hybrid is going to be based on what we know now and a combination of in-person and electronic dynamics. So I'm going to jump to the next slide. The AGM as a production. And this is another thing that we've been talking about. AGMs are always a production, and we may not realize that. But now we have the option of moving from live theater to cinema. In cinema, the budgets have to be bigger, There is a greater use for technology, and there's a lot more going on behind the scenes. In our productions, we have producers who are the chair and the board, and then there's going to be the director, the person behind the scenes in the background who coordinates the meeting, including questions, making certain everyone who might want to speak on an issue is brought to the chair's attention. This would be the role for property management and the service provider. So moving between theater and film can be equated to a painter who moves between acrylics and watercolors. The painter is still a painter, but the medium has changed, and therefore the process will change. As as we all know, AGMs are a statutory requirement. As far as I'm concerned, we have to have AGMs. But in this article from Stage versus Screen, What's the Big Difference by New York Film Academy, they did an interesting comparison. And I would refer you to this resource because of the fact that your boards may be hesitant, or you as a board of director may be hesitant in moving the format. Theater is a nurturing art. The best theater productions have adequate rehearsal time, cast, bonding, and time to experiment with the director before opening night. And that is what our in-person AGMs are like. In our in-person, we have become so familiar with the process that we do all these things. We connect up with professionals. We prepare in advance for these meetings. In contrast, film sets are chaotic places packed with specialized high-paid artists. For an actor, this presents several challenges. For one, you will receive very little, if any, rehearsal time. For another, depending on the size of the role, you may not receive any direction. Films hire actors under the assumption that they will come to the set performance ready. This is very true of virtual meetings and the virtual reality that we live in today. But we've got some solutions today on how you can do your best performances virtually. As well, the venue is very important. The literal difference in physical location between theater and film is one of the greatest obstacles for actors, and it is presenting that as a truth as well for virtual AGMs and in-person AGMs. But we're going to talk a little bit about that to overcome some of those barriers. So as we move through, I would like you to keep in mind, the challenges and what the pros and cons are of each. For in-person meetings, pros and cons. So here, knowledge of in-person meetings. The pro is we know how to do it. The con is we don't know how to do it well. Technology. The pro in the in-person meeting is that people are the technology, they're present. The con is that some people don't even know how to run the meetings. And that's still a challenge, right? Because when we go to an AGM and we see that it flows well in person, we're all very happy as professionals, board members, unit owners. Everybody can take pride in that. And in person, we still have challenges. The pro is that in person, we feel that there's more transparency, but you all know, for those of you that attended meetings that are perhaps a little contentious, that the cons can be challenges to integrity from the floor. In the virtual world, the pro is the ability to do meetings virtually and safely and have them fulfill the obligations of the act. A pro is also that the timing is efficiently used, as well as you've got service providers that are able to bring technology into people's homes to allow them to do this work during a pandemic. A con is that there's a learning curve. The con is we have to change, and we don't always want to change. So does hybrid as a concept hurt or help? Well, it's a little unknown at this point. We're trying to mix in technology. So those of you, for example, who use service providers that will provide you with the ability to vote online and submit proxies in advance, for example, can close their dashboards at a certain time and present to the chair exactly what the information is that they have. And so we see the integration of technology slowly coming into these meetings to make them more hybrid models. So why don't we go to the next slide? And Julia, why don't you take us through where we're going to go?
Okay, so now we're going to take you through the different components of an AGM and what each component will look like if done virtually or as a hybrid, and how these new methods differ from the traditional in-person meeting. So we've broken down the AGM into the following components: the preliminary notice of the meeting before or leading up to the AGM, registration, what happens on the day of the meeting, and then what happens after the meeting, including the important considerations and issues for the board, property management, service providers, and the chair of the meeting. Yeah, next slide, Sam. Yeah, so the first step to hosting an AGM is preparing and delivering the preliminary notice to the unit owners. So we've created this chart to show the differences and similarities between the three types of meetings with respect to pre-notice. We understand that the in-person meeting to be the standard to which these new types of meetings should be compared. The pre-notice package won't be that much different for the virtual and hybrid meetings than for the in-person, but there are some key differences and considerations that Victor and Patricia will speak to in a minute, such as instructions and rules regarding where and how the meeting will be held that should be included in the pre-notice. So for the in-person meeting, the pre-notice is to be delivered to unit owners at least 20 days before the formal notice of meeting, and will be delivered by both mail and electronically, depending on whether the unit owner has entered into an electronic communication agreement and has consented to receiving notices electronically. The pre-notice should specify where the meeting will be held, which will be a physical location, and then all other items which are required to be included under the Act, such as the projected date of the meeting, and a call for unit owners to submit materials to include in the notice. So now I'm going to turn it over to Victor to guide us through the pre-notice for electronic meetings.
Sure, thanks, Julia. So in a virtual setting, the pre-notice is pretty much almost the exact same thing as an in-person AGM. So all the preliminary notice forms that you've already drafted for your previous AGMs, if you're a manager or a board member, should relatively be the same. The only key difference will be that the venue, so on the first page of that pre-notice, there's a venue field, usually where you'd put, for example, the party room or an offsite church or banquet hall. You would now put by Zoom or by video conference, by whatever, Cisco, Google Meetup, whatever video conference system you're using. And then you should probably notate in that field that the actual URL, the hyperlink, the website address related by manager or the board closer to the meeting dates. Usually that's because you won't have that URL right at the pre-notice date. You probably have to get that URL from the service provider when you sign up. And in that sense, it's almost a pre-notice as a heads up to a future notice, hopefully in the actual notice of AGM itself, where the URL, the hyperlink, will actually be contained. And Julia also mentioned the agreement to receive notices electronically. So as I'm sure managers and board members know, in order to be able to send an AGM package, including the pre-notice and the notice package, to a unit owner, you have to have an agreement to receive notices electronically, an ATRNE. So that's a prescribed form. The government has offered a form to have unit owners submit their email address to the condo and basically consent to receiving all the AGM notices in the future by email. Now, the form itself is perhaps not the best as drafted by the government. I know Elia Associates, we've actually added to that form certain privacy requirements and disclosure requirements. And we actually recommend most of our clients use that form instead. But if not, the government website, which is now on the CAO website, has an ATRNE form, an agreement to receive notices electronically, and you can use that. Other than that, though, it's pretty much the same at the pre-notice stage. But of course, if you have are sending the pre-notice out, you should really be talking to service providers if you're going to be holding a virtual AGM, because you got to make sure that they have a date available, that they are available, and that they are cost effective for your condo. And Patricia, do you want to talk about the hybrid model?
Yeah, so in the hybrid model, we have to cover all the technical requirements that Julia and Victor have talked about. And what is important is that everybody needs to be able to get into the meeting. But as part of the pre-notice package in this kind of a meeting, you're going to actually hold it. And this is more in the reality that we're in today, because we have social gathering limits, we have a variety of other constraints around what we can do, because we still have to maintain those social distance requirements. And if your condo has mask rules, etc., we need to be thoughtful about how we actually physically accommodate people in the spaces that are going to have the in-person meeting component. But then what has to happen is we need to also then make sure that in the interim hybrid world, people are aware that once they get their package, they need to tell you which way they will be attending and that there will not be the ability to change your mind. Why is that? Well, because of limits on the number of people in a room, but as well so that you can make the accommodations necessary in order to facilitate people in both types of dynamics. Okay, so why don't we go on to the notice of meeting, Julia?
Okay, so step 2 of hosting an AGM is preparing and delivering the formal notice of meeting to the unit owners. Again, we've laid out the differences between the 3 kinds of meetings in the chart in the PowerPoint for ease of reference. So the notice of meeting is similar to the pre-notice, but the delivery time is different. The notice of meeting must be delivered to unit owners at least 15 days before the date of the meeting. The notice will include some more specific information about the meeting as required under the Act, which will be the same for each type of meeting. So practically speaking, from an in-person perspective, when unit owners receive the notice package, they'll have to decide if they're going to attend the meeting or not. And if they don't plan on attending, the hope is that they will assign and submit a proxy so that they can still exercise their democratic rights as prescribed under the Act. One important consideration for the in-person meeting is that we're still living in a pandemic and there are still social distancing and gathering limits in place. In Ontario, the maximum number of people permitted to attend an indoor gathering is 50. So for the majority of condominiums, this means a large portion of their population won't even be given the opportunity to attend the meeting. So then the question is it fair to only offer an in-person meeting where not all unit owners can attend? And in our opinion, no, this wouldn't be fair, nor would it be democratically correct. It would also be difficult or in some cases impossible for quorum to be achieved at such a meeting. So this is where it becomes critical to adapt and learn to use and benefit from the 2 new options that have become available to condominiums, which are the virtual platform and the hybrid meeting. So Victor, can you tell us a bit about what we should consider with respect to electronic meetings?
Thanks, Julia. So with electronic or virtual AGM, your notice of meeting, again, should, if you have it by that time from your service provider, have the URL hyperlink that talks or that basically sets out that long, basically the hashtag of the letters and symbols and numbers that are unique to your virtual AGM. The reason that you want to include that is so essentially people can try and test out, for example, if they are using Zoom, test out their Zoom capabilities on their laptops or their computers or their iPads or even their cell phones, and make sure that they are able to basically log in and participate on the meeting date. In terms of the notice of meeting itself, though, other than the venue specification of being at a URL or a Zoom conference, or even just to say by Zoom TBD or as per a future notice after the notice of meeting that says what the URL hyperlink will be. Other than that, there's really, again, not much difference between a virtual meeting and a in-person meeting for the notice of meeting stage. It comes down to reminding people that this will be virtual. Don't go down to the party room. Don't go down to the church across the street that you usually have it at. This will be a virtual meeting by Zoom or by video conference only. And of course, that will change if it's a hybrid model. So Patricia, do you want to talk about the hybrid model?
In terms of the hybrid model, again, it's accommodating both. So in this scenario, though, what we need to think about is once we have our room, I'm more concerned about the room because really we're the same on the how and the what methodologies, having the electronic agreement in place. But I'm really concerned about when you're trying to do a hybrid, you're going to have to make sure that the virtual room is set up in the physical room. This means that a virtual meeting is going to be broadcast to those who are physically present and in attendance. So what does that meeting look like? It means that the chair and management and the board are present in person. So you need to make sure that everybody knows that and is comfortable with that. And to the extent that they're not, you're going to have to coordinate that in the virtual room. Chair and management would both, in my opinion, have to have a camera pointed at them so that people can see how the chair is what they're conducting. But also, I also feel that there should be an ability to create a camera that shows the room. You will also have to line up your speakers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but you're gonna have to figure out where they're gonna be. Are you in person with us? A lot of the auditors I've heard are saying, no, we will not be in person. We'll do everything virtually for you, because you know, auditors, they usually do like 6 meetings a night or something crazy. This is gonna allow them the ability to be on time and meet all those other deadlines. So, you know, to me, I think it's also this coordination. Projector and a screen will be, I think, as well necessary so that everybody knows who is in the room. The recording of the meeting will happen through the virtual room, but you will also have your minute taker as you would have, both in person and you know, at the actual event. So to me, this is like things that you have to think about even when you're starting to put out the notice. I know, like, I've taken you into the room for a minute, but you need to think about this so you can set your rules of clear, I guess, engagement to a degree of how the meeting will run so people will understand that as well. So Julia, why don't we transition to before the meeting?
Yep, so after the notice of meeting has been sent out to all unit owners, the real preparation work begins for all those who are involved and in charge of organizing the meeting. For the in-person meeting, this means ensuring that all speakers are able to attend and organizing what they will be speaking about and what role they'll have. This includes engineers, lawyers, and the auditor. The script and any notes for the meeting should be prepared in advance and reviewed prior to the day of the meeting. So this includes calculating the requirements for quorum in advance and delegating speaking roles, along with other items. And then in terms of updating the list of unit owners, property management will be responsible for ensuring that this list is fulsome and up to date, as it will be critical for the registration process. So Victor, how is this different for a virtual meeting?
Sure. So with a virtual meeting, essentially what you want to do as a board and even as managers is do a dry, or what we call a test run. So lots of service providers in the space right now are offering a free test run before the actual AGM date, so that all participants, especially the head table and the chair, the platform can go through their notes, can actually test the platform's capabilities out in a dry or a test run scenario before the actual AGM when everyone else is logged on. So we actually do recommend that every board and every manager and every chair do this test run with the service provider. It's also helpful to run through it because there might be some kinks in terms of technology, but also in terms of what you want to present as a board or as a manager. And this is essentially an opportunity to do a dress rehearsal, going back to Patricia's live theater production analogy. So essentially what will happen is that about a day or two before, or even a week before, I've seen the service provider will send everyone a Zoom link or a video conference link for the head table and the participants at the front of the room, so to speak. And then everybody, sorts out what dates they're available and what times they're available, and then does the whole AGM essentially without the content, just as a test run. In terms of updating the list of owners, now usually in an in-person AGM, you have property management doing that because they're the ones sitting at the head table, sorry, not the head table, the registration table right at the front of the entrance to the room. Now, in a virtual setting, property management does have to provide the service provider with an updated list of owners, and the service providers, if they're good, will continually make sure that it is updated. It's the arrears list is up to date, the tenanted list is up to date, the names are up to date, because they have to basically coordinate their back-end system with the property manager's records of what the list of owners is, what the arrears list is, what the tenanted list is, and make sure that their back-end system is updated. Because you need to have both sets of records essentially aligned. Because again, as I'm sure you know, it has to be a unit who's entitled to vote. It has to be the unit owner. There must not be a proxy entitled for, or not proxy entitled, a proxy submitted for the meeting so that the owner can vote in the virtual setting, and a whole bunch of other considerations that really do depend on the accuracy of the list of owners. And of course, this usually happens leading up to the meeting. Some service providers will stipulate a hard deadline of when you have to give them an updated list. But by and large, most service providers are flexible. But again, it really is important that this has to be accurate. Trisha, do you want to talk about the hybrid model?
Yes, thanks. And you know, with respect to preparation of speakers, reviewing of notes, I 100% agree in either either component of the meeting. We always have that. I know for myself, when I prep for meetings, I create my own script and I do all of the information calculations that I need, for example, quorum requirements, etc. I take care of all of that in advance because you just want to be able to cross-reference things because you're going to, in a hybrid meeting, be managing two rooms, the in-person dynamic and the virtual dynamic. So you need your sensibilities around you, and the more prep you do, I think the better the outcome of the meeting will be and your ability to be present. Um, you know, we have to coordinate all the same elements and then some, as I had taken you through a little bit before. So, you know, to me, all of this has to happen with anticipation. You have to think about how many people you're going to have in the room and how many you anticipate to have virtually present. Make sure that the technology meshes so that there is that clear communication, that people won't question the integrity of the meeting. This is one of the things that we strive for in these meetings. We want integrity, and we get integrity through transparency. We also want to comply with the act, of course, and enforce that democratic right that's been given to people to vote. So that's what a lot of the service providers are bringing to the table as their offerings, is that ability to achieve this through technology, but we're also going to be doing it at a hybrid meeting in person at the same time. And so what you're also going to think about too is timing. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move to the next slide, is when we're in the moment, what do we need to think about? So the more information we can prepare before the meeting, the more efficiently we will run at the meeting. So why don't we advance to the next slide on registration?
Okay, so on the day of the meeting, the first step, other than what has just been discussed, is registration. For the in-person meeting, property management will generally assist or be in charge of generating and providing the updated list of unit owners, which will set out who's in arrears, who's not in arrears, who is a resident owner, and so on, which will be important for owner-occupied director elections. Property management will be the first point of contact for unit owners who enter the room. For in-person meetings, there's more of a human aspect as opposed to the virtual platform, because when individuals come into the meeting room, generally property management will recognize them and have some rapport with each of them. Individuals will be signed in and then will either provide a proxy on behalf of someone else, will sign themselves in and get a ballot, or if they had previously provided a proxy and have now chosen to attend the meeting, they'll let the proxy stand or revoke the proxy, have it marked as void, and then be provided a ballot for voting purposes. So generally, property management will be responsible for this sign-in procedure and for organizing the proxies once they've been received. So Victor, can you take us through what the registration process will look like for the virtual meeting?
Sure. So for registration, most service providers will be the ones who are doing the registration. They usually have a back-end system and a website essentially for people who get that invitation to basically register, which should be in the notice package, basically saying, hey, can you give us your name, your unit number, and basically they'll offer, in most cases, they'll offer for you to give either a proxy or an advanced ballot. Now, the registration basically doesn't involve management. So as opposed to an in-person meeting, it's usually online between the unit owner and the service provider through their website only. The manager just gets the back end part at the very lead-in up to the meeting date. So with registration, it's different where management's not involved as much, but they do have to help the service provider make sure that the records all align up again, because it really is, again, important that it is the person who's entitled to vote for that unit who does the registration. Now, the registration website for most service providers will have a unique hash at the end of that URL. So it's a very long string of letters and numbers. And on top of that, which makes it unique to that unit, but on top of that, there's also, I know that some service providers have IP tracking. So every computer device or whatever you're using to log into the internet will have a unique IP address identifier. And that way, it hasn't been tested in court yet, but that way Condo's service provider can actually track, ideally in an ideal situation, where you are, what device you're using when you do register. And that hopefully helps prevent other people from registering themselves for that unit who are not entitled to have that registration. So again, that usually is sent to people by email. So basically, you'll get an email if you're a registered owner who's entitled to vote for the AGM, and that will be, again, a long URL hyperlink, and then when you click it, they'll track your IP address. And other than that, that's usually what the service providers ask for. I know there's going to be questions about, well, what if someone's child or adult child logs in for their parents? How are you going to know? There is no ID requirement. You don't have to flash your driver's license in front of the webcam in order to register. But hopefully the unique URL identifier and the IP address tracking do help and secure the registration process. Obviously, it's not perhaps as secure as go up to the management table and you have to show your face and the manager recognizes you as the unit owner. But that is the virtual setting we're working in right now. Who knows, down the road, there might be an ID requirement or even a facial recognition requirement. That's, I'm sure, future AGMs might encounter that in my career at least, but we're not there yet. So Patricia, do you want to talk about the hybrid?
Yes, thank you. I think that, the URL is becoming our identifier in this world, and we must guard our URLs very carefully. It is a security issue. Having a good electronic meeting bylaw in place that really addresses elements of concern and perhaps how identity will be determined is part of what an electronic bylaw does. So just as an aside, that's important to note. In the hybrid meeting, of course, you're managing both elements of in-person and virtual, and you have to do it very efficiently in terms of you're going to have somebody at the registration desk taking people in. They'll be doing the in-person registration against the current list. But then what needs to happen is we also need to have good communication between property management and the service provider for the virtual end so that we can consolidate numbers and that we can verify numbers. So you need to have a little bit of time allowed for this to happen. Because in the virtual world, things are pretty fast. They can close, their mediums and their tools so that they can give you a reading. But what we're also going to think about is what type of proxies are being submitted, because now there are 3 types of proxies. But as well, we need to know who's exercising those proxies. How many, how many proxies are exercised by somebody. This is important to understand in either an in-person, virtual, or hybrid meeting, depending on what the issues are on the agenda. Today, we're just talking, really focusing on an AGM, but we've also mentioned bylaws. And as you know, with bylaws, one of the important things to remember is that amendments can be taken from the floor during the meeting at which the bylaw is presented. So the question will be, who has the ability and the authority to vote on those amendments? If you have the most fulsome proxy, which is where it actually allows you to vote on everything and cast your votes, you still can vote on the amendment in the bylaw. And so we need to be able to manage that information very thoughtfully in any of our meetings, but especially in the hybrid, because the chair is going to need to be able to understand the numbers to make sure that when when a motion is made, that we actually understand this, what is being voted on. And we're going to talk a little bit further down on the actual structure of the meeting and the motion. But what I'm going to say to you while it's fresh in my mind is when you're scripting, make sure you have written out your motions and provide them to the service provider. I should have actually mentioned it earlier in advance. Why is that? Because you want them to be able to put it up on the screen because of the way technology works today. Depends on the platform, of course, but you can raise your hand. The first 2 people who will raise their hands are going to be the people who are making the motion and seconding the motion, and then they open it up for voting. But again, it depends on which form of the platform you're using, because that's a Zoom feature in certain aspects of Zoom. There are other service providers that will do it differently. This is what you'll also want to coordinate. But if your service provider has the motions in front of them, you can coordinate better with them and your in-person people at the hybrid meeting on how that's going to happen. Because you will have that flexibility at a hybrid meeting. You could actually take the motion from the floor. So you want to be able to control both dynamics, have it prepared, and then figure out if somebody else in the room is going to make the motion. Okay, so let's go to the day of the meeting because I'm excited to get there. Julia, why don't you start us off?
Okay, so now we've reached the day of the AGM. There are a few initial things for us to consider, starting with how the room is going to be set up. For the in-person meeting, we're all pretty familiar with this setup, and each condo will do it slightly differently, but generally speaking, there will be a head table at the front of the room where the speakers and the chair will sit, as well as the board members. Security may also be present during the meeting, usually standing at the back of the room or by the entryway. And then all unit owners will be seated facing the front of the room and the head table, or standing at the back if necessary. So then once everyone is seated and ready to begin, the chair will call the meeting to a start, introduce all those seated at the head table. And then again, with the in-person meeting, there's a very real human aspect about this where you can easily see and hear who's speaking or who the speaker is referring to, which you're not going to get as much in the virtual meeting. So then the quorum count will be done by the chair in person and will be based on who is in attendance via proxy and in person. If quorum, which is 25% of the owners, is not reached, there can still be a discussion on some matters, but no vote can take place. So Victor, how does this work for the virtual meeting?
Sure. So I'm actually going to try and speed things through with a virtual because, as you can probably tell, we're in a virtual setting right now. And so I'm assuming that most people are pretty familiar with, Zoom and other video conferencing kind of platforms. So I'm not going to get into perhaps the setup of the Zoom call. Obviously, you can see it here. But I will say that as opposed to an in-person meeting, the introduction is now being done by the chairperson, but also by the service provider. So the service provider, most of them will have a live person on the call or on the video conference that will say, for example, how to use a platform, will say, for example, that the meeting is being recorded and will be available later. There's a whole bunch of technological aspects that the person should be explained to everybody at the very beginning as part of the introduction. Now, the other big difference will be quorum. Counting of quorum is usually done by the property management with the chair at the registration table. Now with the service provider at the back end, they will be able to see pretty instantaneously whether quorum has been reached or not. So that quorum will most likely be a chair asking the service provider, have we reached quorum? Yes, and then move on. Basically, the only other thing that's different, essentially, and you'll probably notice this is a very key difference, is the fact that only the head table usually is on screen. So every attendee is usually muted, webcam off. It's really just a head table that has their screens live on and the mic on. That is number one, obviously, in a very large AGM, you're not going to want everybody's mic and webcam on. But you also want to be able to select who to speak. And then if the time runs out or they're going off track, obviously warn them first, but also you can actually cut them off, mute them, and have them no longer be able to participate essentially by video or by audio. As chairs, we get sent to very, very contentious, heated AGMs and requisition meetings and all types of owners meetings. And sometimes we wish we had that in real life, just a mute button and kick someone out. But obviously we don't. In a virtual setting, we do though. And that also helps control the flow of the meeting and the timeliness of the meeting overall. Patricia, do you want to talk about the hybrid model?
Yes, thanks, Victor. Yes, and in the virtual meeting room, Richard is very excited about the mute button. And so, we have to exercise it very carefully, I think, in the virtual reality, because we want to preserve the elements that are important to a well-run meeting and the AGM. So on the hybrid, it's going to be the room setup that we've talked a little bit about, that you have to create the virtual room inside the physical room. And it has to be done in such a way that everybody can participate and see each other. Introductions, I feel that the chair really needs to quarterback this piece. It's very important that the chair do that. And then move to the service provider to provide their technical piece. The chair is the chair. And I think in the hybrid meeting and even in the virtual meeting, we need to distinguish the two. We should also make sure that at the introductions, everybody is up on screen, whether they're in the room. And so that's the need for the extra camera so that you can see the head table, as well as on the screen so that people can make sure that they've got, a clear view And you're going to have to work with your service provider in order to accommodate that piece and how that link is going to be made. And then we're also going to talk about, the quorum count, but, to me, that is something that has to be done in those moments before. We need to get our two parties, both the on-site property manager and, well, with the chair and the service provider, all making sure that the numbers work and that there's clarification on what type of proxies are held, who has ballots and how many ballots there are, because it's all got to add up at the end of the day in the reports. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, so a few more considerations for the day of the meeting are the proof of notice and the selection of scrutineers. Proof of notice is required for all AGMs regardless of how they're held and must be reviewed and confirmed in the minutes. For the in-person meeting, property management will usually bring the physical copy of the proof of notice so that it can be easily reviewed. As for scrutineers, during the voting process of the meeting, the chair will usually just ask for volunteers from the room to assist with counting ballots and proxies. So both of these items seem to require more of a physical in-person aspect. Victor, how have these been adapted for virtual meetings?
Sure. So in a virtual setting, the proof of notice is usually the service provider will flash it on the screen. So they'll share their screen with a PDF copy of, for example, the affidavits or just the letter affirming that the proof of notice, the notice of AGM was sent out, either by virtual means, so by email by the service provider, or by hard copy by the property manager. And obviously that's available for viewing after the AGM in the management office as part of the condo's records, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the key for virtual in terms of scrutineers is that, as everybody probably knows, scrutineers are usually selected by the chair from the body of the people attending in person. In a virtual setting, though, the hard part is, as a scrutineer, you kind of need to see the instruments and the proxies and the ballots and everything yourself. In a virtual setting, the people who are attending the meeting, the owners, don't have access to that. It's always going to be the service provider. Now, there's been some debate whether, for example, if you challenge that from the floor of the virtual meeting, if a unit owner says, I want to be a scrutineer, I don't trust the service provider, can that be done? That will depend most likely on the service provider because a lot of them will not be willing to share their back end with that person. It's proprietary, it's part of their IP. Or they can perhaps accommodate by sharing their screen just in terms of tallies and all that stuff. That remains to be seen on a service provider basis. But by and large, virtual meetings, we do recommend that the scrutineers just simply be the service provider because they have access to the back end data and they know how to use it and they know how to read it and they know how to produce it as part of the evidence later if necessary. Patricia, do you want to talk about the hybrid model?
Well, I'm going to actually not talk about it because I think you guys have covered a lot of the aspects here. I think you just have to manage both elements very carefully in terms of the scrutineers. You may even want to have one in the room. The reason I'm doing that is I'm just looking at the time and I think we will want to be able to have at least 5 minutes for questions at the end, guys. So I think we're going to move into the next slide because it covers some important elements.
Yeah, so now we're going to get into more of the meat of the meeting. That is the auditor's presentation and then the possible removal, and their possible removal, director election candidates, and then other business. So for the auditor, they'll attend the meeting in person, provide an overview of the financial statements from the previous year, and then we'll take any questions from the floor from those in attendance. Following this, there will either be the removal and replacement of the auditor, which is generally done by motion from the floor. For director elections, first there will be an overview of the candidates which were included in the notice of meeting. Then the chair will open the floor up for nominations, so anyone who is physically in attendance can run for a position on the board. And then once all nominations have been received, the chair will close the floor for nominations. Then the chair will run through any director disclosure on the spot for those who've been nominated. Each candidate will have an opportunity to make a statement to those in attendance outlining why they should be elected. And then this process is fairly straightforward and generally runs pretty smoothly. Any other business, which can on some occasions include voting on bylaws and deck amendments, can be dealt with at the in-person meeting as long as it's been included in the pre-notice and notice so that unit owners are aware of these items and can make sure they want to attend, kind of make sure they're in attendance. And then voting will be done by ballot or proxy. So Victor, do you want to take us through the virtual meetings?
Sure. So virtually speaking, in terms of the auditor, same thing. The auditor will present their financial statements. The key thing about a virtual meeting is that the auditor actually is able to share his screen or her screen. And so they can actually take unit owners page by page, line by line through the audited financial statements, which in a real in-person meeting is kind of difficult to do sometimes. You have to wait for everyone to flip to the right page, look at the right line. Here, the auditor can literally highlight, cursor, whatever they want to do. They can actually point everyone right to the actual numbers themselves. In terms of nominations for board candidates, same thing. You basically have a motion, the chair will call for a motion, and if it's a Zoom meeting, for example, you'll have a raise hand virtual button. And if you want to be nominated or nominate somebody from the floor, you can raise your hand by clicking that icon, and then the chair should see the raised hands. And if anything, they can probably enable your mic, enable your webcam, or you can put it in the chat box and say who you want to nominate or if you want to nominate yourself. Same thing with other business. We're going to talk in the next slide about voting. So for example, voting for board members and voting for bylaws, for example. But for now, I'll hand it off to Patricia to finish off the slide here.
Okay, so on the hybrid, I'm not going to repeat what's already been talked about, but you have to be able to facilitate that in the room physically as well as virtually. From my perspective, virtually would be satisfactory on this. And the election of candidates, again, if there are nominations from the floor, these are always a bit of a challenge in the sense that proxies have already been cast and people generally cannot withdraw their ballots at this stage in the meeting. So it is important to note that some of the technology has changed, that where proxies have been put in before, they can be pulled back electronically and they can now get a ballot. But you have to look at the service provider and what their options are in terms of when that occurred. Generally, I would think that that occurs at the beginning of the meeting. And then, you know, later on, we'll talk about other business, but that still has to happen. That's really the only note that I would have at this point on that. So let's go to voting.
Okay, so the last component of the AGM that we want to talk about is voting. For in-person meetings, voting will either be done via proxy or ballot. Only proxies which allow the proxy holder to vote on behalf of the proxy giver will be counted in the voting process. For proxies where option 2 has been selected, the proxy holder will be given a ballot at registration, and then the ballot which they are to fill out themselves will count as part of the voting process. For proxies where option 3 has been selected, the proxy itself will have already been filled out, and that's what will be used in the voting process. So once all ballots have been collected, all proxies have been organized, and the scrutineers have been selected, they'll generally go to the corner of the room or to a separate room and then tally up all the votes. Final count will be provided to the chair, who will then confirm the count and then present the results to those in attendance. After all voting matters have been taken care of, the chair will open the floor for questions. Unit owners and residents will physically raise their hand to ask questions, and then the chair will moderate and control the conversation. Following this, the chair will end the meeting, unit owners and residents will leave, and then the room will be cleaned up. For those who are not physically at the AGM, they'll be able to see the results of any votes, as well as any questions and answers asked when they receive a copy of the minutes from the meeting.
Sure. So in a virtual setting, voting actually will be quite different. Not only will you have proxy voting, but depending on your service provider and what kind of video conferencing system you're using, we usually see kind of 4 options or 4 ways you can vote in a virtual AGM. The first one is by the URL ballot. So when the vote happens during the Zoom meeting, essentially, the service provider will email all the entitled voters who are entitled to vote. And in your email inbox, you should get a link, a separate link to a separate website, usually run by the same provider, that you basically fill out your ballots on the web page and then submit it for your unit. Again, that website a long series of letters and numbers, and they'll have IP tracking as well. The second way we see sometimes is in Zoom, you can have a poll. So if you've been in any other, I guess, Zoom kind of meeting or Zoom webinar, you can actually have the chair or the host issue out a poll. So there'll be a pop-up window. You'll have basically buttons you click, submit, and that's your vote. The problem with that obviously will be that the people who are running the meeting, so the chair and the service provider, will have to really be on top of everything in terms of figuring out whether that person is A, entitled to vote, and B, actually has one vote or more votes if he or she is a proxy holder for other units. So it's very important for the day of the meeting to have your registration records and everything and the proxies in advance so that you can say, okay, well, John Smith, actually his one poll vote actually counts for, let's say, 11 votes because he's got 10 proxies on top of his own vote. And so that's also why in this scenario, it really is important for the service provider to be involved in both the URL balloting method and the polling method. The third way we see sometimes is by the raised hands function. So like I said before, in Zoom, you have an icon sometimes that says you can raise your hand. So what the chair will do is be on video and call for a motion. And because it's a raised hand or not raised hand, it has to be a yes or no question. So it has to be, who votes for John Smith, raise your hand. And everyone clicks that icon, and then the chair will have on their screen basically who's raised their hand, and the chair and the service provider will have to count those raised hands, who is entitled to vote and how many votes that person has. And sometimes what the chair will do is share that screen to everybody and basically say, this is the tally. Lastly, there's a verbal vote option. This is technically not what we call a recorded vote, so it's not a secret vote. If your condo's bylaws require a secret vote, then you cannot do this way. But if the condo's bylaws don't specify and you can't do a non-recorded vote, do it this way. You can actually have everyone turn on the webcam, turn on their mic, and verbally just say who they're voting for. Obviously, this will have to be in a small community with very few unit owners, or else it gets unwieldy, and that's usually not secret, obviously, if everyone can see the video and the audio. And then the question and answer period at the end is usually done by chat box, and so people will put in their questions in the chat box, and the speakers will answer them at the very end, usually in the Q&A portion, via audio and via video, and that way you get your submissions in by writing, but then the answers will be by the video chat.
So on the hybrid piece, I think, what is very important here is to figure out how it's actually going to be conducted and how the information is going to be collated between the people present in the room and the service provider. So this will be an orchestration of, first of all, making sure that the service provider has the motion to close the nominations from the floor. I noticed in the chat box just now, there's a question about whether or not we can eliminate nominations from the floor. No, you can't. You can ask for people to nominate themselves in advance, and that's part of what the pre-notice does now. But at the same time, you can't foreclose that. So it is an item that has to be addressed in a timely way. But you have to have the motion up on the screen, and the chair has to direct the room around that. Cast the vote, aggregate the vote. So the hybrid meeting is going to be a lot of that throughout the room, because it's going to be that the chair is going to have to assess the votes in the room, if they're going to be by a show of hands, as well as incorporate the virtual votes. So this is where I think the technology and Richard's idea of the gamer device is going to be very important to catch up to where we need to be. Because ideally what it would be is that you have your device, which is your phone or some other tool, and then when the actual motion is up on the screen for everybody, virtual and physically, everybody casts their vote then. With respect to the proxies, that would have to be data that was inputted in advance, and that would be worked through with the service provider. So in the hybrid meeting, there's much more going on, and you really need to have good coordination between the producer and the director. So behind the scenes, they need to know where you're going to go. So with that said, and of course, question and answer period will always be important. The idea of having a tool that you can raise your hand on in the virtual room while physically being present is a great idea for those service providers who might be listening today to think about, to say, how can we keep people in sequence? Because that's one of the important things, is making sure everybody in the room is heard. You can raise your hand virtually, and that will help the chair direct how questions will be. As well, in all types of meetings, rules of engagement on how people will conduct themselves is always, well, not always, but in some communities is a must, to remind people, keep it to one question, 2 minutes, respectful, so that everybody in the room can actually have a chance to speak. Now, we're going to jump through to some key considerations, but I think what we're going to do is we're going to try and summarize these very quickly, and I'm just going to take the lead here, guys, because we're running out of time, if that's okay. So if we could advance to the property management, that's great. Thanks, Anab. For property managers, please, orchestrate registration depending on the type of the meeting in advance. Now, you already know all this, so I'm not really, trying to convert the converted, but you can see as we evolve in the models how this is going to change and what pre-thinking is going to need to be done, including working with service providers, not only booking their time, but making sure that you understand each other's processes. Thinking about retraction of proxies and swapping those proxies for ballots, as well as retracting those that are ineligible to vote. That also has to be done early on so we know who doesn't have the right to vote. So our numbers are clear. Because I think, as somebody in the chat room has pointed out, well, what happens if we don't get quorum? And if we discount a lot of proxies, we may not have quorum. And now with the act, we have the ability to call the meeting again and again. So there's 3 shots at this. Then for service providers, definitely same thing, registration, explaining voting and polling, verification of identity, that needs to be communicated to the chair, because the chair will make the call, and I've had to do this myself, on the integrity of how a vote is cast. The URL IP technology piece is an important piece for all chairs to understand. So that when somebody asks you from the floor, well, I forwarded my email to somebody else and that person is going to vote. No, they're not, because the URL will not match in the identifier. As well, what if somebody accidentally gets kicked out of the meeting? You have to know what the backup plan is. Usually you can re-log back in, but you need to have the comfort that you have all the technological pieces around you, bandwidth, etc., that it can actually be accommodated well. If we could have the next slide, please.
So Patricia,
Yes.
I think I can run through these pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I've dealt with so many of these in a virtual setting now.
Yeah.
So Zainab, if you could go to the next slide, please. For key consideration number 1, what if the unit owners don't want to have a meeting? I think Julia touched upon this at the very beginning of this presentation. Have the meeting anyway. Because the unit owners, if they don't want to have the meeting, then that's fine, but I would say try and have the meeting and say, look, if we don't meet quorum, then that's on you guys as unit owners. You guys didn't basically meet the quorum. We tried, it's not on us. So if you're the board manager, I would strongly suggest try having the meeting anyway. Second question is usually, should you do a run through? Yes, again, it's usually free with certain service providers. And again, it's a dress rehearsal essentially, and it's very important for you guys to do so. Which platform should you use? Basically, there's a bunch of different industry players that are now in this space because they realize that A, there's a demand, but also B, that most condos will need to have some sort of hybrid model, at least in the future. So we're not going to recommend a certain brand or service provider, but you do want to talk to them in advance, talk to all of them, and basically make sure that it works for your community. Some service providers will be better for large communities, some will be better for small communities. What happens if you don't host your AGM this year? There's no condo police. There's never been a court application on just an AGM not being held within certain timelines. If you miss the November 22nd timeline to hold a virtual AGM, but you don't have an electronics meeting bylaw on Untitled, you basically should have it electronically anyway if COVID is still a thing by then. And in the beginning of that AGM, have the votes to enact the electronics meeting bylaw, so that even though it won't be registered on title because your lawyer will have to do that in the next morning probably, you'll at least have the unit owners all voting for an electronics meeting bylaw at the very beginning, and then continuing to have the AGM by electronic means after that. Campaigning protocols and proxies, that will differ in an electronic or virtual setting, just because most of the time with COVID, we don't want people knocking on doors and talking to people face to face. You can usually engage in people by email or by, nowadays there's Facebook groups, whatever other kind of social media groups that are out there. You can campaign that way. There's no need to go door to door. If there's no electronic agreement with unit owners, I basically have to recommend that in that case, you have to send them a hard copy of the AGM notice and the prelim notice. But you can always email them if you know their email address anyway. Email them, see if they are willing to give you a consent form, and then you can skip printing that whole package in hard copy to them. Is a video recording a record of the corporation? So that hasn't been judicially tested yet. We don't have a clear answer from the courts or the CAT even. My feeling is that it will be. So most minutes are, of course, records of the condo. The minute taker's notes, though, his personal handwritten notes, for example, during the meeting, it's an in-person one, those have actually been ruled not to be a record of the condo. At the same time, though, an audio recording of the AGM has been held to be a record. So really, we have to wait for the courts and the CAT to figure that out. My feeling is that it will be a record of the condo. And can a hybrid meeting really work? I'm going to leave that to Patricia to perhaps address at the very end if there's time. That it can, but she will elaborate further. And then next slide, Zainab, the very second last one. So for the chair, if someone challenges the vote, as Patricia's mentioned, she's actually being challenged in court and of course in person. regarding her call on the votes, but ultimately it is the chairperson's call on the validity of the votes. How do you deal with candidate nominations from the floor? So again, in person and virtually and in hybrid, if somebody nominates themselves from the floor, they most likely did not submit a directive disclosure form. So you'll have to, as a chairperson, run through those questions on the form, any conflict, any litigation, any arrears, yada, 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 either in person, or the chair will have to do it by the webcam, by the mic, and that person will have to either answer those questions in the chat box or turn on his or her mic and webcam to answer them verbally. And lastly, if an individual is being difficult during the meeting, online versus in person, as a chair who's, I'm sure Patricia has also chaired many difficult meetings, I wish I had a mute button. I wish I had a kicking out button that I have in the virtual setting. In an in-person meeting, you either need the cops, a big security guard, or just to convince him to leave on his own if he's being or she is being difficult. Online, a lot less leeway, a lot more power to the chair to just mute and kick out. And then finally, I think we have some time for Q&A. I know we're above or outside the 1 hour timeline that we told you guys we'd try and stick with.
We can take a couple of questions if you want.
Sure. So I'm just going to go through the chat box here. The first question from Paul Giladakis: is there a penalty levied against the condo if they go past the deadline date? Again, no condo police. Unit owner could technically bring you to court, to Superior Court actually, and say the condo hasn't held an AGM within the timelines, or they've held an AGM but it was virtual and there was no electronic meeting bylaw. Again, I don't think a judge in the Superior Court will be very sympathetic to that. Everybody understands it's COVID time. There's, in-person gathering limits. Everyone's kind of running with this whole new world. I think a judge will be pretty sympathetic. From Sriram Rangan, for the current technologies available to do a hybrid, as Patricia mentioned, it will be a projector most likely and a screen with a webcam capability so that both sides, the in-person head table, and the people in the audience and the virtual people can all see each other. Have we done a virtual meeting where we've had tech issues? Of course, everybody has tech issues, and essentially you kind of, you deal with it as you go. Everybody understands. And a virtual meeting does have time allotted for tech issues to come up. So for example, in a vote, people might not always get that email that is sent to them with the URL to vote. There is some time that service providers do set aside during the voting process to talk to each individual individually if they have issues. And it's about the same amount of time as it would take to count a vote in person, for the scrutineers to go to that separate room, open the box, count the ballots and proxies. It's about the same time. So tech issues can be dealt with. I believe the Act allows 3 attempts at an AGM with no quorum. Yes, the AGM requirements for quorum and the 3 attempts are still the same. How do you control outsiders from attending? So again, the URL hyperlink is unique to every individual, and the service providers do track your IP addresses. Hopefully that's enough.
Well, I think the other thing too, Victor, is that you can
Yes.
have people into your unit. You could have a party and you wouldn't know that there's a party going on in the background and people observing your AGM, just like people now are using their phones at in-person meetings to record meetings and then posting it on YouTube. So, you can set some parameters and limit and warn people. But, with the accessibility to technology today, it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, so speaking of accessibility of technology, Noel D'Souza did ask, if you're holding a virtual AGM, does a condo have an obligation to provide the technology to owners to allow them to participate? Technically, no. Obviously, if the condo has the resources, you might as well invest in it. Unfortunately, technology does develop pretty quickly, so that tech might be outdated by the time the next AGM rolls around. Legal obligation to provide the technology up front to owners.
I would confirm you don't have to buy people computers. Right.
Yeah, and again, you can participate by phone. Most people have mobile phones now with smartphone technology, and you can access Zoom that way on your smartphone. It is an issue with especially older demographics, but there's no legal obligation. John McLeod has asked, in the past you've asked for a motion to destroy the ballots after 90 days. Does that still apply for the video? Again, if the video recording is held to be a condo record, I do recommend asking for that motion just to be able to destroy the video after 90 days. There should be minute takers either in the phone call, in the video call, or if it's hybrid, either in person or in the video call, and those minutes that the minute taker creates will be a record of the condo as per usual. So you don't need the video per se after 90 days. Scarlett asks, Does it make better sense to establish a deadline? Yes. So for direct nominations, you should always set a deadline in the pre-notice. There's a field for that in the prescribed form by the government so that all board candidate names are on the proxies. However, that does not eliminate the ability to nominate somebody from the floor. That is still available in both in-person, virtual, and hybrid models. You can always be able to nominate somebody from the floor. And lastly, if John McLeod asks, if the nominee cannot attend the meeting and is not available and have not signed the disclosure, can they not be accepted? So technically speaking, you have to, as a board candidate, give your disclosure either in advance or at the actual AGM. If they are not there and they have not attended, have not submitted a direct disclosure form, even if they're elected, that does not count. They're basically immediately disqualified after they're voted in. Last question from Stephanie. We're interested in holding an AGM by paper. Okay, can you please discuss the hows of this method? Okay, I've never seen an AGM held by paper. I don't think that's a viable solution because the Act does require, again, going back to the definition of electronic or telephonic means, you basically have to have real-time ability to correspond with each other. Because you're gonna get motions from the floor, you're gonna get weird hiccups and wrinkles that people have to vote on. And so I don't think a paper one is valid. Patricia, do you want to take that question and end up?
No, I think I would agree fully on that, Victor, because I think there are challenges of just trying to do it by paper. I think you'd still have to, first of all, call the meeting, and people would be allowed to attend at that meeting if they so wish, so that it is an interactive dialogue. I think the closest thing you get to paper is that everybody's done everything by proxy, and there's a person chairing the meeting, and they're sitting there by themselves with the auditor and maybe the board members, but people have already cast their votes, the proxies will still apply. But can you force that to be the way of people attending? No, you can't. You've got to be able to allow for interaction. So
one last thing, Stephanie just followed up. I know of at least 20 condos doing it this way. So I will say this, the 4 methods of voting I described in the previous slide, the 4th method, and everyone just kind of raising their hand saying on webcam, who they're voting for. You could do it that way. You don't need a service provider technically for that. You can just have a Zoom account and everybody just does a meeting if it's a small enough condo. But again, recorded vote, that is not a secret ballot, and some condos have that requirement. If you don't, you can try doing it that 4th way if you're a small enough condo.
Yeah, and another piece of technology is using SurveyMonkey as well, so that you can track the results of your survey if you're able to do it virtually. I can't comment on those 20 that are doing it this way. It's not, if they're okay doing it that way and they're happy that they got their vote through their paper proxies, that's okay with us. We don't have a problem with that, but you still have to call the meeting. The meeting has to technically exist in a moment in time because there are minutes requirements as well to track what happened at the AGM. You want to make sure your corporate records are clean and that they're fulfilled. So, I thank you all for your time. I'm sorry we went a little over. This is a very rich, robust topic as we transition into film. It's not live theater only anymore, but it's going to be a combination, and we need to master the technology. But I would leave you with this, is that the statutory requirement to have an AGM hasn't changed, pandemic or not. Now, the government has given us some flex, and Julia was very good to summarize our obligations. But that's what you need to be striving towards. So everyone, take care, stay well, be healthy, and I hope the next few weeks goes very well for your communities. And if you need us, we're here. Thanks again. Take care.